Hello and welcome. In this episode, I'm going to be sharing stories that involve mimicry. This is a tactic that can be employed by many different types of cryptids, with the notable ones being wendigos, skinwalkers, and mimics. I've also recently heard that this can be done by Sasquatch and crawlers as well. The stories in this episode include a familiar voice calling the dog even though the person was nowhere close, voices of relatives calling out to people when they either weren't home or nearby at all, and a voice calling out at an apartment complex gate. But first, we start with a very creepy encounter at a relative's cabin in northwest Maine. Also, if you'd like to help support the channel, click on the join button below. Alright, let's get into today's stories. The first story of this episode comes to us from Maine, where the original poster, or OP, had an extremely creepy experience while visiting family. What happened to her during her visit in 2017 has stayed with her since. She has posted her story online to see if anyone could possibly explain what happened to her. She was 16 years old at the time of her encounter. The OP mentions she is half indigenous, because the uncle she visited was on her mother's side of the family, the indigenous side, which the OP drove her grandfather to so they could visit during the fall. The cabin is small and could only fit the OP's aunt, uncle, and grandfather, so she would be staying in a camper located farther back in the woods. The first evening went off without a hitch, with them visiting and catching up before eventually turning in for the night. The OP grabbed a flashlight and made her way toward the camper where she'd be staying. She made it about halfway when she turned off her flashlight so she could admire the night sky. That's when she noticed just how quiet the forest was. No birds, no crickets, no rustling leaves. Just an unsettling silence. She was then hit with an intense feeling of dread as the hair on the back of her neck stood on end. Something inside her told her she should run to the camper as fast as she could, and she also had a gut feeling that something was watching her. Accompanying the dread was the feeling that she should not be there. When she made it to her camper, she double-locked the door and closed the blinds. She swears she could hear her heart pounding within her chest, but she managed to laugh at herself for getting so worked up over nothing. However, she had a very restless night when trying to sleep and could have sworn she heard footsteps and movement around the camper during the night. She kept telling herself that it was just deer or curious animals, but her dreams suggested otherwise, as they were, according to her, haunted by something she could not see. When morning came, everything seemed normal. The OP thought about mentioning what happened to her grandfather at breakfast, but thought he might dismiss her experience as her being overdramatic or being, quote, too used to the city life. So she tried to put her trying night behind her and enjoy the day with her family and their dog, a large German Shepherd, which she did. That evening, just for the sake of her nerve, she asked if the dog could stay with her that night. So she and the dog set out for the camper, and their walk was fine until they hit the tree line. She thought it might have been because she felt nervous, but thought it was just because she was on high alert after the previous night. However, the dog seemed on edge as well, with his ears perked up while looking into the forest. She felt safer with the dog sleeping in her bed with her, but she still had a terrible dream. She woke up to find the dog staring at the wall with his hackles up. The next morning, she packed her belongings for their departure that afternoon, before leaving the trailer and letting the dog out into a small field nearby that was between the cabin and a thick part of the woods. While in the field, they were playing with a ball, which the OP would kick for him to excitedly retrieve and bring back to her to do it once again. They played the game until she accidentally kicked the ball too hard and it rolled to the edge of the forest. She watched as the dog sprinted down to grab the ball, but he passed the ball and instead stopped while digging his paws into the dirt. His ears were pinned back and he was standing rigid and unmoving with his fur standing straight up. She called for him to come, which he normally did the first time without hesitation, but this time he didn't even acknowledge the OP. She started walking toward him while still calling his name, but nothing. She reached him and grabbed him by the collar, gave it a tug, and loudly yelled his name. But he was just staring into the forest. She only noticed then that the forest was completely silent. Seconds later, that silence was broken by a voice yelling back. Her voice, except it was delayed and distorted, sounding like her, but not sounding quite like her. The OP froze and looked into the trees and the darkness within, holding her breath. Then another scream came from the forest, again in her voice. She turned and ran to the cabin, crying to her aunt and trying to tell her what just happened, and that there's something in the woods. Her aunt comforted her and said it was probably nothing, but the OP says she got the feeling her aunt wasn't saying what she really wanted to say. She also says that her family is superstitious, especially her, and her aunt just didn't want her to overthink what happened. The OP and her grandfather left for home that afternoon, and she has not been back to the property since. She posted her story online after a friend suggested she do so to see if anyone could tell her what she encountered during her trip to Maine. She says she isn't sure if it was a cryptid, a bad spirit, or just her overactive imagination. Based on the details given, I'm thinking this was a cryptid with the ability to mimic. As I mentioned in the intro, there are a number of cryptids that have this ability. However, based on what she said about the nightmares she had and something unseen being there, I'm thinking this could have been a Wendigo. I've done several stories where Wendigos seemingly invade and alter people's dreams, and it seems like that's exactly what happened here. Plus, there was the mimicking voice she heard, and she described it as sounding distorted when replicating her voice. Like her, but not quite like her. That's something that comes up in a lot of Wendigo stories. But to be fair, this is also something described in other stories where the cryptids mimic either the OP's voice or someone's voice they know. Another thing that makes me think this could have been a cryptid was how still and quiet she said the forest got and the feeling of dread that came over her. Both are very common in cryptid encounters. Plus, she said she felt like she was being watched. That's something else that is a recurring theme in these stories. In any case, to answer her question as to what this could have been, I definitely think it was a cryptid, and my guess is a Wendigo. What do you think she encountered during her trip to Maine? And do you think it was a Wendigo or something else? The next story comes from someone who had a very strange experience late one night outside her apartment. She does not say where her story takes place, just that she lived in an apartment complex with small buildings that sat separate from each other and had about 6 apartments in each. The tenants of her building were a pretty close group that looked out for one another. Each building had a gate, she says, with a metal grill that let you see who was on the other side. Whoever would come in the gate last would lock it for the night. This usually ended up being the OP because she got off work at around 3 in the morning. She would then stay up for about an hour or so watching television. This meant she was up until about 4 in the morning or after. So if anyone who lived there needed to get in, they would call out to her, being that she was up and lived on the first floor. When this happened, she would let in whoever had been locked out. Therefore, she would leave her light on and her window open so she could hear if someone called out her name. Well, one night, as she sat up watching TV after work, she heard a familiar female voice call out her name. But she was so engrossed in what she was watching on TV that it had her undivided attention, and she did not look out her window to see who was there. She kept her eyes on the television as she got up to retrieve her keys before running out the door to the gate during a commercial so she didn't miss a second of her show. But as she got to the gate and went to unlock it, she noticed that no one was there. In fact, she could see all the way to the next building and there was no one in sight. This sent a surge of fear running through her and she scrambled back inside, locked the door, and turned off her TV. She sat there trying to figure out whose voice she heard. Then she recognized it as the old lady who lived upstairs. She found this odd as the elderly lady would not have been out so late by herself. Later that week, she ran into her neighbor and asked her if it was her outside that night. The old lady was confused by the question and joked that it must have been the forest spirits who wanted to come inside their building for a visit. Being that they live near a forest, my first guess in this one would be some sort of cryptid that can use mimicry. Too bad the OP didn't look out the window when she heard the voice. Perhaps she could have caught a glimpse of what had called out from the gate, if it even was at the gate at the time. Cryptids who use mimicry can often throw their voices, and it's usually said that when the voice sounds far away, the being is close, and the closer the voice is, the farther away the being. Evidently, the voice was so convincing that the OP didn't think twice to run out to let in the presumed person waiting outside. That must have been a very creepy feeling, looking up to see no one there, and then seeing no one in sight. She made it sound like no one could have disappeared in the time it took her to get up and go outside after hearing her name called. In any case, this would have been beyond creepy. What do you think called out the OP's name that night? The next story is actually two short encounters where the people commenting on the original post heard voices. The first one comes to us from a poster who had an experience while visiting a relative who lived in the middle of nowhere, completely surrounded by nothing but forest. What he experienced out there in those woods has stuck with him to this day. While he was there, his relative had a celebration and a lot of people came over to camp out. There was a big tent where they had the party with music and dancing. Most of the children, ROP included, ran off to play in the forest, but still close enough to the house. As it got darker, only the older siblings in the OP were left out in the forest playing on and around a trampoline. When they decided it was time to head back to the party, they started jogging. Being that he was younger, the OP fell behind, and as he jogged, he heard his eldest sister's voice call out his name from around the side of the house. What made this even odder than it already was the fact that the voice called him by his name when his immediate family and relatives called him by a nickname. No one ever called him by his real name. He got a strong gut feeling when he heard his sister's voice that he shouldn't go to it, so he went back to the big tent where the party was still going on. There, with his father, was his eldest sister, and she had been there the entire time. The next story happened to the OP right before she posted it online as a response to another post. She was at home on a quiet Sunday afternoon cleaning her kitchen. She noticed how quiet it was outside and found this odd because she normally heard some of the neighborhood children running around playing outdoors when it was nice out. They are usually loud and rambunctious, as she puts it. She had just finished loading the dishwasher and was about to head outside to have a smoke, but as she was putting on her flip-flops, she clearly heard her daughter's voice coming through the open door, calling for her mom. When her daughter is looking for her around the house, she normally calls out for her. Except her daughter wasn't there. She was at her father's house. The voice the OP heard sounded exactly like her daughter, including the inflection and tone she always uses when calling out for her in the way she does. Just after she heard her daughter's voice, her phone rang and it was her daughter calling. In the first story, I'm glad he resisted the urge to go around the house to see if it was his sister calling out his name. Always trust your gut. But how creepy would it be to clearly hear your sister's voice calling from one direction, only to go back to the party in the opposite direction and find that she hadn't left the party the entire time? As for what this was, there's no telling. It doesn't surprise me that this happened in the middle of the woods though. Of course, being that I cover cryptids, that's where my head always goes first, thinking that this was a cryptid. What do you think it was? As for the second story, one commenter said the OP's motherly intuition kicked in and she heard the voice of her daughter because she somehow knew she was about to call. This is intriguing, but the fact that the OP said it was completely silent outside makes me think this was something else. Normally, when it's as quiet as the OP described, it's because a cryptid is nearby. And then there's the fact that the voice came from outside. Again, being that I cover cryptids and have had many stories with similar conditions, that's always my first guess, a cryptid. But there's no telling what this could have been without further details. What do you think was mimicking the daughter's voice calling out for her mother? The final story of this episode comes from a poster who heard a familiar voice call their dog, who responded at first but then stopped before going too far. The original poster does not say where exactly their story takes place, just that they live in a fairly remote location in Northern California, and that a national forest borders 3 sides of their property. The OP was in the garden visiting with a friend, and as they were sitting there, they heard the OP's partner, who they called Bob, call for the dog. He sounded close, but the OP knew he was about 100 yards away. Upon hearing the voice, the dog jumped up and ran a few steps before stopping mid-stride. The OP wondered if it was Bob calling for the dog, then why he would be calling for the dog, and finally, wait, was that Bob? They asked the last question just as the dog halted, front leg raised. The OP and the friend looked at each other with their eyebrows raised, and the OP asked if his friend heard it too. After answering in the affirmative, they both felt as if something was amiss. It was at this point the OP realized the voice was way too close to be Bob. Something was definitely off about the situation, so they called out for Bob and asked if he called the dog. Bob was hard of hearing and yelled back what, so the OP yelled louder asking if he had called the dog. In return, Bob's response was to yell the dog's name, and the dog took off toward him. The OP and the friend once again looked at each other, eyebrows raised, and agreed the whole situation felt weird. About 10 minutes later, Bob came and joined them in the garden, and the OP once again asked him if he had called for the dog earlier. He said he called for the dog because the OP told him to. The OP asked him if he had called for the dog before then, and he said no, so the OP explained to him what happened before. Bob immediately dismissed it as a raven mimicking him calling the dog, but the OP immediately dismissed this because there's no way a raven could sound exactly like him. So much so that it would fool them, the friend, and the dog. Also, there's the fact that they never hear ravens talk around their home. The story then jumps forward 3 weeks when the OP is talking with a group of friends and mentions that they had never been creeped out at their home before, but couldn't stop thinking about what happened. One friend agreed, then remembered something and turned to ask Bob if he had called out someone's name earlier in the day. Bob told him that he hadn't called out that person's name at all. The friend then told the OP he could have sworn he heard Bob's voice calling out for them earlier, but it wasn't from where he thought Bob was at the time. There are neighbors to the north of the property, but they are way too far for the OP to hear them, and they sound nothing like Bob. The OP began researching corvids, which is a family of birds that include crows, blue jays, magpies, and ravens. There are ravens and stellar jays on the property, and the OP admits that maybe the first mimicking of Bob's voice could be attributed to a raven, as he calls out for the dog often when they are outside. But the second one is a little harder to accept. Bob does not say the person's name enough for a bird to pick it up and mimic it. The OP also researched cryptids and had a native tell them that they believed an entity lived on a nearby mountain. The OP was told it wasn't good or bad, just that the natives stayed as far away as they could from that mountain. They end their post asking if anyone has any thoughts as to what this could be. Poor Bob. You have to kind of feel sorry for him at this point. Something out there is mimicking his voice, and he is constantly being asked if he is calling out this name or that. Sounds like it's trying to get him into trouble. In all seriousness though, I don't think this was a raven. Like the OP said, I don't think a raven could perfectly mimic someone's voice to the point where it could fool 2 people and a dog. However, I could be wrong about this. One key fact that the OP mentions is that their property borders a national park on 3 sides. And what famously lives in national parks all across the country? Cryptids. As for what this could be is anyone's guess, as there are multiple cryptids out there that can mimic voices, some perfectly as described in this situation. Then there is the native person the OP spoke with, saying an entity lived on a nearby mountain. They are usually in tune with the land and nature, so perhaps they know something more than they wanted to say to the OP. But given the fact that they stay far away from the mountain as possible, that's pretty telling. I think they are dealing with a cryptid here. The best thing they could do is ignore the voice and hope it loses interest. This is usually the case when people don't engage with whatever is trying to make contact with them. What do you think this was? Could it have been a raven that mimicked Bob's voice? Or do you think it was something else? Or could Bob be a trickster and able to throw his voice? And that's going to do it for this episode. I hope you enjoyed these stories. If you'd like to hear more stories like these and other types of cryptids, make sure to subscribe to the channel. If you want to send me your story, I'd love to read it. My email is wolfwhocriedcryptid@gmail.com. I will also put it in the description below. With your permission, I may want to use it in an episode. Even if you'd prefer that I didn't share your story on my channel and just want someone to listen, email me. We can privately talk about your encounter. And please remember to keep it civil in the comments section. No one deserves to be ridiculed whether they believe or not. Thank you for listening. I'll catch you at the next episode.